The morning it all came apart, I was standing at the kitchen sink in my bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, watching steam curl up toward the ceiling of a kitchen that had been in my family for 41 years. Julian was behind me. I could hear him before I could see him. That particular cadence of footsteps that meant he was performing for someone. Each step placed with just a little more weight than necessary. The way a man walks when he wants the room to notice him entering it. And there was someone with him. I could tell by the way he cleared his throat, the way his voice dropped into that lower register he reserved for business associates and golf partners and people he was trying to impress. "She doesn't really understand the numbers," he said, and I heard the other man, Marcus Chen, his business partner, a man I had served dinner to no fewer than 30 times, offer a short, polite laugh. I didn't turn around. "Eleanor handles the house," Julian continued, and I could hear the smile in it, the dismissal wrapped in a compliment the way you'd wrap a rock in tissue paper. "I handle the portfolio." And then, because apparently that wasn't enough, because apparently the kitchen needed to hear it too, he said it. "She's a good woman, but honestly, if we'd relied on Eleanor to build anything, we'd be renting a studio apartment in Stamford." Marcus said nothing. The silence after that sentence had a texture to it, something soft and slightly embarrassed, the way silence sounds when a witness doesn't want to be a witness. I set my coffee cup down on the counter, very slowly, very carefully, and I thought about the deed. I thought about the deed that was filed with the Greenwich Town Clerk's office on March 14, 1987. The one with my grandmother's signature, and then my mother's signature, and then my name typed beneath both of them in clean block letters. I thought about the trust documents that lived in a fireproof box on the top shelf of the closet in what Julian called Eleanor's office, the room he never went into because it was full of what he described as old paperwork and sentiment. I thought about the conversation I'd had with my attorney, Patricia Holloway, 6 weeks prior, in which Patricia had said to me, with characteristic calmness, "Eleanor, the man has no legal claim to this property whatsoever. None. He never has." I thought about all of that, and then I turned around. "Good morning, Marcus," I said. Julian looked at me with that particular expression, indulgent, slightly condescending, the expression of a man who believes the woman in the room is always about 3 steps behind the conversation. "We're going over the Harmon proposal," he said, as if I'd asked. "Of course," I said. "I'll stay out of your way." And I walked out of that kitchen, down the hallway, lined with photographs that went back 3 generations of women who had built things quietly, and I picked up my phone and called Patricia Holloway and told her it was time. Now, before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you what those documents revealed and what that morning in the kitchen became the beginning of, I need you to understand who Eleanor was before she became the woman holding all the cards. Because the story doesn't start in that kitchen. It starts about 40 years earlier, in a house that no longer exists, with a mother who made choices I still think about every single day. Are you ready? Because this one is going to stay with you. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Enjoy the rest of the video. My mother's name was Margaret Ashworth, and she was, by any honest accounting, one of the most capable women I have ever known. She could read a balance sheet the way other women read novels, with genuine pleasure, turning pages slowly, noticing things other people missed. She had grown up in the house on Hillcrest Road in Greenwich, the one I now live in, at a time when women of her background were expected to translate their intelligence into decoration. Be the beautiful wife, be the gracious hostess. Let the men do the numbers. She did not let the men do the numbers, but she was also a woman of her time in ways that shaped her blind spots. She had 2 daughters, me, Eleanor, and my younger sister Diana, and she loved us both. I believe that completely. But she loved us differently, and that difference had consequences that neither of us fully understood until we were adults. Diana was the one who got the Saturday morning trips to the country club. Diana was the one who got the new dress before the school dance. Diana was the one my mother introduced first at parties. "This is Diana, my youngest, isn't she just?" With that particular trailing sentence that implied everything the speaker wanted you to imagine. I was Eleanor, my older one, which carried no such invitation. It wasn't cruelty. I want to be clear about that, because cruelty would have been easier to name and therefore easier to survive. It was something more subtle, a persistent low-grade signal that Diana was the one who would be watched, and I was the one who would be trusted to manage herself. And in a strange way, that trust became the most important inheritance I ever received. Because while Diana was being presented and admired and gently guided toward the right kind of marriage, I was left largely alone in the house, alone with the books in my father's study, alone with the old files in the storage room off the kitchen, the ones with the property records and the trust documents and the correspondence between my grandmother and her attorney that went back to 1961. I read all of it, not because I had a plan, but because I was curious, and because no one was paying close enough attention to wonder what I was doing. My father died when I was 16. Heart attack, sudden, on a Tuesday morning in February when the ground was hard with frost and the house felt 3 times its normal size. He left behind a modest insurance policy, some debts that my mother handled without discussion, and a house that was, I learned from those files, held in a trust that had been structured by my grandmother specifically to pass through the female line, not out of feminism exactly. My grandmother had been a practical woman, and she had watched enough of her friends' husbands gamble away, or drink away, or simply mismanage away the family properties, and she had decided, with quiet New England certainty, that the house would belong to the women. The deed restrictions were specific. The property could pass to daughters, not sons-in-law. A husband could live in the house, could enjoy it, could tell his friends he lived in Greenwich, but he could not own it, could not borrow against it, could not sell it. The house was the house's own thing, in a manner of speaking, and it would pass as my grandmother had intended. My mother explained none of this to Diana or me while we were growing up. It simply wasn't discussed. And when I asked her about it once, I was maybe 19, home from my first year of college, she looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to read at the time, something between pride and caution, and said, "Some things don't need to be announced, Eleanor. They just need to be known." I filed that away. I filed everything away. Diana got married at 24 to a man named Robert Hatch, who sold commercial insurance and had a generous laugh and very little patience for complexity. They lived in a house in Fairfield that Robert had chosen, and Robert had financed, and Robert considered entirely his. Diana seemed content with this arrangement. She had grown up being presented, and Robert presented her beautifully. They had 3 children and a membership at a nice club, and a life that looked, from the outside, exactly as it was supposed to look. I married at 28. His name was Julian Mercer. I met him at a dinner party in the city. Mutual friends, the kind of gathering where everyone is performing slightly elevated versions of themselves. Julian was tall and confident, and had the particular quality that certain men develop in their early 30s when success starts to feel like their natural habitat rather than something they're still working toward. He was in finance, investment management, he said, though the details shifted depending on the conversation. He had good taste and good manners, and a way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room, which was intoxicating until you realized he looked at everyone that way. He was also, beneath all of that, afraid. I didn't see it then. I was 28, and I found his confidence magnetic and his attention flattering and his intelligence genuinely impressive on the subjects where he was actually intelligent, which were real. He was not stupid. That is important to say. Julian Mercer was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his entire sense of self on the scaffold of other people's perception of him, and when that scaffold wobbled, he could not reach for anything beneath it, because there was nothing beneath it. That was what I didn't understand for a long time. We dated for 14 months. He proposed in a restaurant in the city with a ring that was more expensive than he could comfortably afford at the time. I found this out years later because the gesture needed to be visible. We got married in June in a garden ceremony, small and beautiful, and then we moved into the house on Hillcrest Road because my mother had, quietly and without ceremony, transferred the trust to my name the year before. She did not tell Julian what the trust contained. He did not ask. And that, right there, that small, unremarkable moment of not asking, was the first stone in a wall that would take 17 years to finish building. Now here is the thing I need you to hold on to, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. From the very first week we lived in that house, Julian behaved as though it were his, not aggressively, not consciously, but in the way that water behaves in a container. It takes the shape of whatever it's in. He walked through those rooms with the ease of ownership. He told his colleagues he had a place in Greenwich. He said my house before I'd ever heard him say it, and I told myself it didn't matter. It was just language. It was just the way men of his generation spoke. But it mattered. It mattered in the way that small, unchallenged fictions always matter, because they grow. The clock that I didn't know was running had already started. We had 17 years on it, and I was only just beginning to understand what I was actually holding. The inciting incident, the thing that changed everything, did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope with a return address I didn't recognize, slid through the mail slot on a Wednesday afternoon in October while Julian was in the city, and I was at the kitchen table reviewing invoices from the contractor who'd been doing work on the East Wing. I opened it, thinking it was something routine. It was not. It was a letter from an attorney's office, Pemberton and Graves, LLC, out of Stamford, informing me that my husband had applied for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $450,000, using the property at Hillcrest Road as collateral, and that there were certain questions about the title that needed to be resolved before the lender could proceed. I read it twice, then I read it a third time. My hands were very still. That is the thing I remember. Not shaking, not trembling, just perfectly, unnaturally still, like the moment before a sound you know is coming, but haven't heard yet. Julian had tried to borrow against my house. He had gone to a lender, presented the property, and signed documents implying he had the authority to use it as collateral. Either he genuinely didn't understand the trust structure, which would mean 17 years of living in this house and never once looking at the actual paperwork, or he understood it and had gambled that no one would check carefully enough. I sat there for a long time with that letter in my hand. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia Holloway. Patricia was not a dramatic woman. She was in her early 60s, had practiced real estate and trust law in Connecticut for 30 years, and had the particular quality of very good attorneys everywhere, which is that she never let you see her surprised. "Read me the letter," she said. I read it. There was a pause. "All right," she said. "Don't respond to them directly. Don't say anything to Julian yet. Come into my office Thursday morning and bring everything. The trust documents, the deed, the transfer papers from your mother, all of it." "Patricia," I said. "Yes." "How worried should I be?" Another pause, shorter this time. "About the house?" "Not at all. The trust is ironclad. Eleanor, your grandmother's attorney was Morris Finch, and Morris Finch was the most careful man who ever practiced law in this county. That property is yours in a way that no court in Connecticut would disturb. Then what should I be worried about?" "What your husband was planning to do with $450,000, she said. "That's the question." The line went quiet between us. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, and the October light was doing something complicated with the maple trees in the front yard, turning them the color of old copper. "I'll be there Thursday," I said. I set the phone down and looked at the letter again. $450,000. The Harmon proposal. The business trips to New York and Boston, and once memorably to Chicago for what Julian had called a potential anchor investment that he'd seemed feverish about for weeks before going quiet on it entirely. Something had gone wrong in the portfolio. I was sure of it, and Julian, rather than tell me, had decided the house was the solution. He came home that evening around 7, loosening his tie in the doorway the way he always did, dropping his bag by the stairs the way he always did, and saying, "What's for dinner?" the way he always did, as if the day behind him was already filed and the evening was a fresh page. I had made dinner. I had also made a decision. "How was the city?" I asked. "Fine. Busy. The Harmon thing is moving." He opened the refrigerator. "Is there wine open?" "There's a bottle on the counter." He poured himself a glass, took a long sip, and leaned against the counter with the ease of a man in his own home. "You get the mail?" The letter was in my cardigan pocket. "Nothing interesting," I said, and I smiled at him. The conversation I had tried to have, the one that should have happened after I received that letter, the one where two adults who had been married for 17 years sit down together and discuss a financial crisis honestly. That conversation never happened. Not really. I tried. On Friday evening, after my Thursday meeting with Patricia, after I had sat in Patricia's sunlit office and looked at the trust documents spread across her mahogany desk and felt something click into place inside me that had been slightly off-axis for years, I tried to begin it. "Julian," I said, We were in the sitting room, the one with the original crown molding, and the fireplace that his mother had once said was almost too grand for everyday living, which was one of the nicest insults I'd ever received. "I need to talk to you about the house." He looked up from his phone. "What about it?" "I received a letter," I said, "from Pemberton and Graves." Something moved across his face, fast, quickly controlled, gone. If I hadn't been watching for it, I'd have missed it. "Real estate thing?" he said, his voice perfectly level. "A home equity line of credit," I said, "in your name, for $450,000, using this property as collateral." He put his phone down. And then something happened that I had seen before but never quite catalogued. Julian gathered himself. It was a physical thing, a slight squaring of the shoulders, a lift of the chin, the precise posture adjustment of a man who has decided the best defense is a controlled offense. "I was going to tell you," he said. "When? When the details were sorted. You don't need to be involved in every preliminary conversation, Eleanor. The word. You don't need to be involved. As if I were an employee being managed, rather than a person whose property was being offered as collateral without her knowledge or consent." "Julian," I said, keeping my voice very even, "this house is not yours to borrow against." And there it was, the shift. The moment the conversation stopped being about truth and became about status. "Excuse me?" he said. "The property is held in a trust, my family's trust. You are not on the deed. You cannot use it as collateral." He stared at me for a moment, and then he laughed. Not a mean laugh, not a cruel one. Something worse, a dismissive laugh, the laugh of a man explaining something simple to someone who has confused herself. "Eleanor, I've lived in this house for 17 years. We're married. Community property. Connecticut is not a community property state," I said. "And even if it were, a trust supersedes." "You need to stop," he said. His voice had dropped, gotten quieter, which with Julian was always more dangerous than loudness. "You are talking about things you don't understand. I have attorneys. I have people who handle these things. So do I." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I watched him try to locate the version of me that he was comfortable with, the one who deferred, the one who handled the house, the one he'd described to Marcus Chen as a good woman who didn't understand numbers. He was searching for her. He didn't find her. "This is not your decision," he said finally. "It's entirely my decision," I said. "It's my house." The silence after that was different from other silences we'd had. It had a shape to it. Julian stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard, the old oak tree at the property line, the stone wall that had been there since before either of us was born. When he turned back, his face had settled into something I recognized from business photographs, composed, strategic, faintly cold. "We'll discuss this when you're thinking more clearly," he said, and he left the room. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. I sat in the chair with my hands in my lap and thought, so that's how it is. The next morning, Marcus Chen called me, on my personal phone, which meant Julian had given him the number deliberately. Marcus was smooth about it. "Checking in," he said, just seeing how things were going, very friendly. But the message beneath the friendliness was clear. Julian had told his partner that Eleanor was having some concerns about a property matter and might need some reassurance about the numbers. Marcus was calling to provide that reassurance. "It's a solid deal," Marcus said. "The Harmon Group is serious. Julian's got a real opportunity here if he can front the capital. The house is just—" He paused, chose his word carefully. "A temporary bridge. The house isn't available as a bridge," I said. "A beat. Eleanor? It was lovely hearing from you, Marcus." I hung up. I poured myself a coffee and stood at the window in what Julian called my office, the room full of old paperwork and sentiment, and looked at the fireproof box on the top shelf. And I thought about what Patricia had said. The question isn't the house. The question is what he needed the money for and why he couldn't ask you directly. Marcus's call had just answered that question. Julian had told his partner before he'd told his wife, which meant I was not a partner to Julian. I was a resource, and he had just tried to liquidate me. I looked at the fireproof box, and I started to make a plan. 2 weeks later, Patricia told me something I hadn't expected. She said, "There's more." We were sitting in her office again, the Thursday after the failed conversation, and she had a file open on her desk that was thicker than the one I remembered. She had been doing her own investigating, she explained, cross-referencing some public records, following up on a few threads that the initial conversation had opened. And what she'd found was not alarming in the legal sense, because legally I was secure. But it was something. Julian has been carrying debt, she said, setting her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose. Significant debt, not the house, not anything you're tied to. This is his personal portfolio, the management company. He has a business line of credit through a private lender in New York, and it's being called. The room was warm. Patricia's office always smelled like old wood and good coffee, and I found myself grateful for the smell, something to anchor to. How much? I asked. The line of credit is just over $280,000, but that's not the whole picture. There's also a loan from the Harmon Group, the people he's been positioning as his investors, that appears to have been structured as a personal advance. He took money from the people he was supposed to be raising money for. She paused. In investment management, that is a very serious problem. How serious? Potentially career-ending. Depending on how it was structured, potentially criminal. I sat with that for a moment. Criminal. The word sat in the warm air between us. He doesn't know you know any of this, Patricia said. No. And the lender, Pemberton and Graves's client, they've gone quiet since we sent the notice about the trust structure. They know they don't have a valid claim on the property. She folded her hands on the file. Eleanor, I want to be very direct with you. Your husband is in financial freefall. He's been trying to solve it quietly, which is why you're the last to know. The equity line was his Hail Mary. Without it, I'm not entirely sure what his next move is. I looked at the window behind her desk. The November sky was the color of slate. There's something else, she said. I looked back at her. The Harmon advance. The personal loan from the investors. There's a woman's name on some of the correspondence, as a co-signatory on some of the communications. She slid a single page across the desk. Her name is Lydia Park. She works in the Harmon Group's New York office. I looked at the page. A name, an email address, a date. Patricia didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. I drove home in silence with the document on the passenger seat and my hands very steady on the wheel, the way they'd been the morning of the letter. That particular stillness that I was learning to recognize as my body, knowing something my mind was still processing. Lydia Park. There was a cashmere scarf in the back of Julian's car that I had noticed 3 weeks ago and told myself was nothing, was a colleague's, was nothing. There was no need to. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment with the engine off. The house rose above me, warm and solid, and 3 stories of late 18th century New England architecture that had been in my family for 60 years. The stone walls, the iron fence, the old copper beech at the corner of the property that my grandmother had planted as a sapling in 1952. My house, mine. And in that moment, I felt something shift, the way a tide shifts. You don't see it happening, you just notice, suddenly, that the water is different than it was. I got out of the car, I went inside, I made tea, and I began to understand that the story I was living was not the one I'd thought I was in. December arrived slowly, the way it does in Connecticut, the cold settling into the ground before the sky fully commits to it. Julian and I had reached a kind of armed truce in the house, civil, surface level, performing a marriage at each other across the dinner table, while something large and unacknowledged moved beneath it. He had dropped the equity line conversation, just dropped it, without explanation or acknowledgement, the way he dropped things he couldn't win, simply moved on, recalibrated, and never mentioned it again. I had been watching for signs of his next move, which Patricia said might be an attempt to renegotiate the trust structure, or an approach to my family about the property, or possibly a direct legal challenge if he got desperate enough. What I had not been watching for was kindness. In the first week of December, Julian was kind. He brought home flowers, not the generic grocery store variety, but actual ranunculus from a florist in the village, in colors I loved. He made reservations at the restaurant in Old Greenwich, where we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary. He said, at the dinner table on a quiet Tuesday, I've been thinking that I've put too much into the Harmon situation at the expense of being present. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I looked at him across the candlelight. Thank you for saying that, I said. And I watched his shoulders settle slightly, the way they did when a gambit was working. He was not sorry, or perhaps a small part of him was. People are never entirely one thing, and Julian's complexity was part of what had made me love him. But the apology was tactical. He had decided, with the quiet efficiency of a man who has pivoted 100 business meetings, that the direct approach wasn't working and a flanking maneuver was required. Make Eleanor feel heard. Re-establish warmth. Find a softer moment to revisit the financial situation. I said none of this out loud. I let the warmth happen. I let the flowers sit in a vase on the dining room table. I let the anniversary restaurant dinner be pleasant because it genuinely was. Julian, when he was trying to be charming, was still the man I had fallen in love with, and that had always been the most complicated thing. But I also, quietly, called my sister. Diana and I had not been close for years. Not estranged, not hostile, just distant, the way people go when their lives diverge too completely. She lived in Fairfield with Robert and the 3 kids and the country club membership, and I lived in Greenwich with Julian and the silent architecture of a marriage I was only now fully mapping. We talked at Christmas, and sometimes in the summer, but I needed someone I could trust who wasn't a professional, someone who had known me before I was Eleanor Mercer, and she was the only person who qualified. She came for lunch on a Saturday in early December. We sat in the kitchen, the good kitchen, the one with the original hearth that still worked, and I poured coffee and told her everything. Not a summary, not a version, everything. The letter, the equity line, the Harmon Group, Patricia, Lydia Park. Diana listened without interrupting, which was something she'd never been good at when we were younger. She sat across from me with her coffee cup held in both hands and her face doing something I recognized from childhood, that particular focused stillness she had when something genuinely surprised her. When I finished, she said, "How long have you known about the woman?" 3 weeks. "Have you said anything to him?" "No." She nodded slowly. "What are you going to do?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I need to understand everything first, before I do anything." She put her coffee cup down, and then she said something I wasn't expecting. "Mom knew, didn't she? About the trust. That's why she kept it quiet. She was protecting you." I looked at her. "From what?" "From having to fight for it before you were ready." She paused. She knew Julian wasn't right. She never said it, but I saw it on her face at the wedding. That particular look she got, like she was filing something away. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the first real cold of winter was settling, and the bare trees in the yard stood against a gray sky like script. "She didn't tell you either," I said. "About the trust?" "No." Diana smiled slightly. "I didn't need to know. It wasn't my house." She looked around the kitchen, at the copper pots hanging on the rack, at the window with the view of the yard, at the old clock on the wall that had been there since before either of us was born. "This was always yours, Eleanor, even when we were kids." I knew that. I felt something then. Not grief exactly, not relief, something between the two. "I didn't." "I know," she said. "That's the difference." She left in the early afternoon. I stood in the doorway and watched her car move down the driveway, and then I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, just sitting, with the cold light coming through the windows and the house settling around me the way old houses do. My mother had known. She had structured a wall around me 20 years before I needed it, and she had never said a word, because saying a word would have required acknowledging the things she was protecting me from, and she was not a woman who named things she wasn't ready to address. I thought, "Mom, you impossible, impossible woman." And then I thought, now I have to be ready. Christmas came and went with its rituals. The tree in the entry hall, Julian's mother visiting for 4 days and sleeping in the East guest room and making her observations about the house with the particular expertise of a woman who believed it should have been hers by rights, the neighbor's party that we attended together, and at which Julian laughed loudly and stood with his hand on my back in the particular way that had always meant we're performing well tonight. We were 2 people performing a marriage at each other, and we were very good at it. But in January, it collapsed. I found the emails. I was not looking for them. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. I was not going through Julian's devices in the night, was not stalking his accounts, was not doing any of the things that would make this story less clean than it is. What happened was this. Julian had been using the laptop in my office, the room full of old paperwork and sentiment, because his own had needed a repair and was at the shop. And when I went to use my laptop one afternoon, I found that his email was still open in the browser. I closed it. Then I opened it again. The conversation with Lydia Park went back 8 months. It was not ambiguous. Parts of it were financial. She had been helping him draft communications to the Harmon Group investors, which explained the co-signatory documentation Patricia had found. But most of it was not financial. Most of it was personal, in a way that answered questions I had been carrying for 2 years, without quite knowing I was carrying them. I did not read all of it. I read enough. Then I photographed the screen with my phone, closed the browser, left the laptop exactly as I'd found it, and walked downstairs. Julian was in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, and he looked up when I came in and said, "I was thinking we could do that place in Westport this week, if you—" And I said, "Sure, sounds good," and walked past him to the sitting room and sat down and looked at the fireplace for a while. He called Marcus that night, from the study with the door closed, which he'd been doing more often lately. The walls in this house were not thick. It was not that kind of house, and I could hear the cadence of the conversation without the words. Marcus's voice through the phone, urgent. Julian's responses, shorter, clipped. The Harmon Group was moving. Something was happening. I texted Patricia, "I need to move faster than we planned." She replied within the hour, "I'll need 2 weeks to prepare everything. Can you hold?" I looked at the text for a moment, listening to Julian's voice through the study door. 2 weeks. The January cold was deep and settled. The hearing, I had learned from Patricia's preliminary conversations with the county clerk's office, was tentatively set for the first week of February. 2 weeks. Can you hold? I thought about my grandmother planting a copper beech tree in 1952, having no certainty whatsoever that it would still be there 70 years later, planting it anyway. I typed back, "I can hold." And then the thing happened that blew up what little time I had left. Julian fired their housekeeper. This was the woman who had cleaned and maintained this property for 11 years. Her name was Rosa, and she was quiet and professional, and had a son at the University of Connecticut, and always remembered which cleaning products irritated my sinuses. She had been here longer than the marriage was comfortable with. Julian told me over dinner that he'd let Rosa go, just like that. The way you might say he'd let a parking spot go. When I asked why, he said they needed to streamline expenses. When I pointed out that Rosa's salary was my expense, paid from my personal accounts, as had always been the arrangement, he said, with that quiet, particular coldness that I had learned to read as panic, "We're one household, Eleanor. The distinction isn't useful right now." I called Rosa the next morning and told her the situation had changed and asked if she would be willing to come back under a new arrangement. She said yes, with characteristic efficiency. I did not tell Julian. But what Rosa told me when I spoke to her was something she had been sitting on for 6 weeks, uncertain whether to say it. In December, she said, a woman had come to the house. Rosa had answered the door while I was out. The woman had been polite, professionally dressed, and had said she was there to meet Mr. Mercer about a property matter. Rosa had told her to wait, had gone to find Julian, and had seen the expression on Julian's face when he came to the door. Not surprise. Recognition. He had seen the woman and said quietly, "I told you not to come here." And the woman had said something Rosa couldn't hear, and Julian had told Rosa to take the afternoon off. "I didn't think it was my place," Rosa said. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer." "You don't have any reason to apologize," I said. I hung up and sat with that information for a long time. Lydia Park had been to my house. She had stood in the doorway of the house in which I was raised, the house my grandmother had planted a copper beech tree in front of, the house that carried 3 generations of women's names in its deed, and she had been there for a meeting about a property matter. My property. The armed truce was over. January was nearly done. I had less than 2 weeks. I called Patricia and said, "Move it up. Whatever you need to file it now." February came in with ice on the roads and a cold that felt intentional, and I spent the first 5 days of it in a state of the most organized calm I have ever experienced. Something had happened in me over the previous weeks that I can only describe as a clarification, the way water goes clear when it stops moving. I had stopped reacting. I had started acting. I had spent the final week of January at Patricia's office, methodically going through every document in my possession, every record, every letter and deed and trust instrument and property tax statement and bank record that had any bearing on the house, the marriage, or the question of what exactly had been built here and by whom and for whom. The picture that emerged was not entirely a surprise, but it was comprehensive in a way that was almost breathtaking. The house, owned outright, in trust, by me, completely clear of any claim by Julian or anyone he'd attempted to involve. Julian's business, in serious distress. The personal advance from the Harmon Group, the money he'd taken from investors, which Patricia now confirmed had totaled $160,000, was being called. The private lender in New York was threatening action. His business partner, Marcus, who had begun to understand the dimensions of the problem, had consulted his own attorney. The relationship with Lydia Park, 8 months of documented correspondence, some of it explicitly financial, all of it clearly personal. And one more thing, the thing Patricia had saved for last, setting it on the desk with the particular care of someone who understands the weight of what they're placing down. Julian had filed a draft document, never executed, with a property attorney in Stamford. It was a draft petition to the probate court to challenge the trust structure on the grounds that, as the surviving marital partner in a long-term marriage, he had accrued an equitable interest in the property regardless of the trust's terms. It had never been filed. It was a draft, nothing more. But it told me exactly how far he had been willing to go, and it told me exactly how little he understood about the trust's actual legal foundations. He didn't file it because he got advice that it would fail, Patricia said. Would it have? Spectacularly. She removed her reading glasses. Eleanor, your grandmother's attorney, Morris Finch, was not just careful. He was brilliant. The trust is structured with specific anticipatory language around spousal challenges that was rare for its time. Your grandmother had apparently been very clear about what she was worried about. She'd seen it happen to friends, I said. Women losing properties to husbands. Yes, and Morris Finch made sure it couldn't happen to her line. Patricia looked at me directly. Julian could challenge this trust for the next 20 years, and he would never, ever succeed. I looked at the draft document on the desk. He doesn't know that, I said. No, she said. He doesn't. The moment I'd been preparing for, the moment I'd known, on some level, was coming since I'd first read the letter from Pemberton and Graves, had a date now, February 7th, a Wednesday. The occasion was what Julian called a house meeting. His term, not mine. A phrase that had made me set my jaw when he'd announced it the previous week, the implicit authority in the word meeting, the implication that the house was a business concern to be administered rather than a home to be lived in. He'd invited Marcus Chen. I invited Patricia Holloway. The Wednesday of February 7th was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that makes everything look etched, shadows sharp on the snow, the sky so blue it seemed almost artificial. The copper beech in the front yard was bare, its branches making their familiar pattern against the sky, and I stood at the kitchen window that morning with my coffee, that same cup, that same window, that same posture as the morning this all began, and felt the long arc of it. Rosa had laid the dining room table. Good china, coffee, a plate of pastries from the bakery in the village. I had dressed carefully, not formally, but deliberately. Dark wool trousers, a cream sweater, my grandmother's small pearl earrings. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a woman in her own house. Julian came downstairs at 10 minutes to 10, also dressed deliberately, and we smiled at each other with the perfect politeness of two people preparing for very different outcomes. He kissed my cheek. He smelled of the cologne I had bought him for his last birthday, which felt, in this particular moment, like something I should note. Marcus arrived at 10 exactly. He was well-dressed, composed, wearing the careful expression of a man who knows something is about to be unpleasant and has decided to be professionally neutral about it. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Eleanor, lovely to see you as always," and I offered him coffee. Patricia arrived at 10:04. Julian looked at her and then looked at me, a question moving across his face before he controlled it. "Eleanor's attorney," I said, and my voice was exactly as pleasant as it needed to be. "I thought it would be helpful to have her here, given that we're discussing legal matters." "This isn't a legal proceeding," Julian said, and there was a note in it, the first warning note, like the first rumble of something. "Of course not," I said. "She's just here for context." We sat at the dining room table. Patricia had her briefcase. I had a folder. Marcus had, I noticed, a leather portfolio, which meant he'd also prepared. Julian had nothing visible. He operated from memory and presence and the force of his own conviction that he was the most competent person in any room. I want to talk about the future of the house, Julian began. He looked at me, not at Patricia, as if Patricia were a prop. I think we all agree that the current situation is— Julian, I said, before we go further, I'd like to put some things on the table. He paused. All right. I opened my folder. The trust that governs this property was established by my grandmother, Evelyn Ashworth, in 1961. It was transferred to my mother, Margaret Ashworth, in 1979, and to me, Eleanor Ashworth Mercer, in 1994. I have a certified copy of the trust instrument, the deed as recorded with the Greenwich Town Clerk, and the transfer documents for each generation. I set them on the table. Patricia, would you walk us through the key provisions? Julian's eyes moved from the documents to me, to Patricia, and back. Patricia opened her briefcase. The trust contains, and I'm quoting directly here, explicit restrictions against any transfer, encumbrance, hypothecation, or equitable assignment of the property to any party not designated as a successor beneficiary under the terms of this instrument. Julian, you were never designated. You have no legal standing to encumber this property. She set her own copy of the trust on the table. Additionally, there is language specifically anticipating spousal challenge proceedings, which would render any such challenge legally futile. Marcus Chen looked at the documents. Julian said, Eleanor, this isn't— I'm not finished, I said. He stopped. In October, I received a letter from Pemberton and Graves on behalf of a lender to whom you had applied for a $450,000 home equity line of credit, using this property as collateral. You did this without my knowledge and without any legal authority to do so. I set the letter from Pemberton and Graves on the table. In January, I became aware that you have an outstanding personal advance from the Harmon Group in the amount of $160,000, which appears to have been structured in a way that your investors did not fully authorize. Marcus had gone very still. I also have documentation of a draft petition to probate court that you commissioned in November, which Patricia has confirmed would have had no chance of success, which is presumably why you chose not to file it. The draft document. On the table. Julian's face had changed. The composure was still there, technically. He was too good at this to lose it entirely. But underneath it, something was shifting, the way ice shifts before it breaks. And, I said, I have email correspondence, photographed from a browser session on the laptop you were using in my office, that makes clear the nature of your relationship with Lydia Park, who, I understand, visited this house in December. The room was absolutely silent. Marcus Chen looked at his leather portfolio with the expression of a man who deeply wished he were somewhere else. Julian, Patricia said, her voice completely neutral, I'd encourage you to say nothing at this point and to contact your own attorney before we proceed further. Julian looked at me, not at Marcus, not at Patricia, at me, and in his expression was something I had not seen there in a very long time. A kind of nakedness, the composure stripped down to something raw underneath. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was different, lower. I need you to understand that I was trying to protect you. From what? I said. From having to worry about the money, from having to know how bad it got. He made a gesture, hands open, an appeal. I never meant for you to— Julian, my voice was very quiet. You tried to borrow against my house. You brought another woman into my house, and you told your business partner that I didn't understand numbers. I paused. Which numbers didn't I understand? He had no answer. Marcus stood up. He picked up his portfolio with the careful movements of a man removing himself from a situation that is no longer his to manage. Julian, I need to make some calls. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I'm genuinely sorry. He looked at me, and I believed him, which was something. He walked out of the dining room, and a moment later I heard the front door open and close. The three of us who remained sat in the silence of the house. There's a process, Patricia said, to both of us, but really to Julian, because I already knew. The marriage will need to be addressed separately from the property, since the property is entirely unaffected by any marital proceedings. The house will remain in the trust. Eleanor's position there is secure regardless of any other outcome. She looked at Julian directly. What I would strongly suggest, for everyone's sake, is that you engage counsel quickly, and that we handle this with as little noise as possible. Julian was looking at the table, at the documents, at the deed with my grandmother's name on it, my mother's name beneath it, mine beneath that. 3 generations, he said, almost to himself. Yes, I said. He looked up. I didn't know it went back that far. You never asked, I said, not unkindly, just as a fact. The February light was coming through the dining room windows, that particular winter light that is low and very clear, and it fell across the table and across the documents and across Julian's face, and it made everything look very precise, very still, the way things look in the moment, just after something important has stopped being uncertain. I'm going to go upstairs, he said. All right, I said. He stood, and for a moment he looked at the room, the crown molding, the old fireplace, the photographs on the wall, the copper pots I'd kept from my mother's kitchen, and his expression did something complicated that I did not try to read. Then he went upstairs. Patricia looked at me. You all right? Yes, I said. And then, because it was true and because Patricia had earned truth, I'm sad, but I'm all right. She nodded. She began to organize the documents back into her briefcase with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been in many rooms where important things have just been settled. The next steps will not be quick, she said. There will be proceedings. It may take time. I know. The house will not be touched. I know. Eleanor. She paused, briefcase half open. What your grandmother built here. Most people don't get that kind of foundation. Most people are managing damage their whole lives because nothing was built under them. She built something under you. I looked at the door through which Julian had gone. I know, I said again. I just didn't know it until I needed it. The months that followed were not simple. I want to say that because I have no interest in telling a story that ends cleanly when the truth is that things end in layers, some of them slow and some of them unexpected, and none of them quite the way you imagined they would feel. The divorce was filed in March. Julian retained counsel, a firm in Stamford that specialized in high-conflict matrimonial cases, which told me he had intended, at some point, to contest something, although by the time we were actually in proceedings, his attorney had clearly advised him that there was very little to contest. The house was unreachable. His career was in serious difficulty. The Harmon Group situation had escalated, and there were regulatory inquiries that Marcus and the firm's attorneys were managing in a way that made Julian's position untenable. He resigned from the firm in April. Marcus, in what I suspect was a move of both self-preservation and genuine decency, cooperated with the regulatory investigators and provided documentation that ultimately established that Julian had acted unilaterally, without partnership authorization, in taking the personal advance. Julian left the house in late March on a Tuesday morning when the air smelled like mud and early spring, and the copper beech in the front yard was just beginning to show the first reddish tips of new leaves. He took his personal things, clothes, some books, the set of golf clubs his father had given him, a lamp from the study he'd always liked. He did not take anything that was the house's, because by that point he understood thoroughly what was and wasn't the house's. He stood in the entry hall with his bags and looked at me, and I looked at him, and we were both, I think, inhabiting the memory of 23 years of standing in various doorways, looking at each other, the 1,000 versions of this moment that had been nothing more than a Tuesday morning. I'm sorry, he said. He said it differently than he had in December, differently than he had in February. It sounded less like a strategy and more like something he actually was. I know, I said. I didn't. He stopped, tried again. I told myself I was protecting you. The numbers, the business, I know, I said again. You always understood more than I thought you did. Yes, I said. Most people do. He picked up his bags. He walked out the front door. He did not look back at the house. A mercy, I think, for both of us. I closed the door and stood in the entry hall with the particular silence of a large house that has just gotten quieter. Not empty. The house is never empty. It's too full of itself for that. But quieter. A different kind of sound. I walked to my office, the room with the old paperwork and sentiment. I stood at the window and looked out at the yard, at the copper beech with its first new leaves, at the stone wall that had been there since before any of us was born. I thought about my grandmother, planting that tree. I thought about my mother, filing those documents. I thought about the chain of women who had understood something essential about what it means to build something for the people who come after you. And I thought about the question I'd been asked at a dinner party 17 years ago by a woman I barely knew, who'd learned I was engaged to Julian Mercer. "What does he do?" she'd asked, and I'd said he was in finance, investment management. And she'd smiled politely and asked, "And what do you do?" with that slight pause before you, the pause that meant, "And what do you do that matters?" "I take care of a house," I'd said, which was true and insufficient and the only answer I'd had at the time. What I should have said, what I know now, standing in this office in the quiet of a March morning, was, "I hold something. I hold something that was built before me and will outlast me. I hold it carefully, and I understand its dimensions, and I know what it is and what it isn't, and who it belongs to. That is what I do. That is what I have always done." By summer, the house felt different in the way it hadn't in years. Itself, fully itself, without the overlay of someone else's performance of ownership. I had Rosa back, 3 mornings a week, and the East Wing repair was finally finished. And Diana came for a long weekend in July with her 3 children, and they swam in the pool and ate dinner on the terrace. And her youngest, a girl named Grace, who was 7 and had her great-grandmother Margaret's eyes, stood in the entry hall looking at the photographs on the wall and asked, "Who are all these ladies?" "They're your family," I said. "They lived here?" "Most of them were born here," I said. "Your grandmother was, and her mother before her." Grace considered this with the seriousness of 7. "And you?" "I was born here too." "And you're going to stay?" I looked at the photographs. My grandmother in her 20s, serious and slightly squinting at the sun. My mother at her wedding, before my father, before any of it. Myself at 6 in the backyard under the copper beech tree when it was barely taller than I was. "Yes," I said, "I'm going to stay." Grace nodded, satisfied, and went back outside to find her cousins. Patricia called that afternoon. The regulatory matter involving Julian had resolved in a way that wasn't criminal. There had been insufficient evidence of deliberate fraud as opposed to extremely poor judgment, but his professional licenses were under review, and the civil settlement with the Harmon Group investors had been substantial. He was, as far as I could tell, starting over from a reduced position in a field where his reputation had been significantly damaged. I did not feel triumphant about this. I felt something closer to the sadness you feel when you see a thing turn out the way it was always going to turn out once you understood the whole picture. Lydia Park, for what it's worth, had not been what Julian perhaps imagined. She had a life of her own, a complexity of her own, and whatever she'd been to him was not ultimately a landing pad. The last I heard, through the specific grapevine of legal proceedings, she had left the Harmon Group and moved to another city. I did not spend time on this. It was not the story that mattered. The story that mattered was this: the house, the deed. The trust instrument my grandmother had created in 1961, with Morris Finch's precise and careful language, building a wall around something she loved for people she would never meet. The transfer documents in my mother's handwriting. The fireproof box on the top shelf of the office. The story that mattered was women building things quietly, and the things lasting. Marcus Chen sent a card, handwritten, simple. "I should have spoken up at the beginning. I'm sorry I didn't. I hope you're well." I thought about that for a while. He was not a villain. None of them were exactly. Julian had been afraid and proud and had let those 2 things make his decisions for too long. Marcus had been complicit by inaction, which is its own kind of failure, but a different one. And I had been, silent for too long, in my own way, trusting that the truth would eventually be obvious to everyone, when truths are only obvious to people who are looking. I had learned to look. I planted something in the fall, a small Japanese maple in the corner of the kitchen garden, where my grandmother had once kept herbs. It would take years to become itself. That is the nature of trees. And I would be older when it was fully grown, and whoever came after me would be older still and might not know who put it there. That is also the nature of trees, but it would be there, growing toward whatever it was going to become, on this land that had been in my family for 60 years and would, with care and intention and the particular stubbornness of women who understand what they're holding, be in my family for 60 more. The evening I planted it, I sat on the back terrace with a glass of wine and watched the light go long and golden across the yard. The copper beech was full and enormous in the late September light, and the stone walls were warm with it, and the house behind me was absolutely itself, solid and old and particular and mine. I thought about the morning it had all started, standing at the kitchen sink in my bathrobe, with my coffee going cold, while Julian explained to Marcus Chen what I was and wasn't. I thought about the stillness in my hands when I'd read the letter. I thought about the long middle of it, the patience of it, the particular quality of waiting when you know what you're waiting for. I thought about what it meant to hold something, and then I stopped thinking and just sat there in the evening light, in the quiet of my own house, and let the day be what it was. There's a certain kind of story people expect when they hear a title like this one. They expect rage. They expect confrontation, a spectacular scene, the moment where the wronged woman stands up and delivers the line that ends everything. And we had our moment, the dining room table, the documents, the February light, and it was real, and it was necessary, and it was, in its way, satisfying. But the more important thing, the thing I find myself thinking about now, months later, on a quiet morning with coffee and the October light coming through the kitchen windows, is not the confrontation. It's everything that came before it, the 60 years of building, the document my grandmother created in a law office in Stamford in 1961, the woman who understood that you don't protect the people you love by announcing your protection. You protect them by building something solid under their feet before they need it. Julian called me a failure in passing as an aside in a kitchen to an audience of one. He said it the way you say things you believe so thoroughly that you've stopped noticing you believe them. And I stood at the sink and I held the cup and I said nothing, because what I was holding was bigger than the need to respond. The house is still here. It will be here after me. When Grace comes back, when she's grown and has her own life, and perhaps her own complications, and her own questions about what she's standing on, the house will still be here. The deed will be in the fireproof box. The trust language will say what it has always said, in Morris Finch's careful words, and the copper beech will be older and larger and will have been through things we can't predict. And maybe she'll stand in the entry hall and look at the photographs, and there will be a new one on the wall. A woman in her 50s, in a dark garden, holding a Japanese maple sapling that is barely taller than her arm. And someone will tell her, that was Eleanor. She held the house. She understood what she was holding. That's enough. That's always been enough. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.